Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a very special edition of our Way Forward workshop, Leader Lunch Break. I want to give a special shout out to Nikki DiFilippo, alumna who made this introduction to our distinguished speaker today possible. We're grateful to you for the suggestion and for making this all happen. Thank you, Nikki. And now, Dr. Mauro Guillén holds an endowed chair in international management at the Wharton School. He is a well-respected scholar, teacher, consultant, and keynote. He is the recipient of numerous awards that I will not take the full hour to list, but a few highlights: the Aspen Institute's Faculty Pioneer Award, the 4th Fundación Banco Herrero Prize, awarded annually to the best Spanish social scientist under the age of 40, a host of Wharton teaching awards, including one on curricular innovation, and a long list of awards for his publications, scholarly papers, and books, including the Gustavus Myers Center Award for an outstanding book on human rights and the President's Book Award of the Social Science History Association. He is a former Guggenheim and Fulbright Fellow and a member in the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Dr. Guillén is best known for his comparative studies of companies and management practices in Western Europe, Latin America, and East Asia. But at the present time, he's engaged in research on the new political economy of the 21st century and on the rise of multinational firms from emerging economies. He serves as the vice chair of the Global Agenda Council on Emerging Multinationals at the World Economic Forum. He is a trustee of the Madrid Institute of Advanced Study in the Social Sciences and a member of the advisory boards of research departments of several corporations. You may have seen him as a frequent commentator on Bluebird TV, NPR, on BBC Radio, CNBC, ABC Action News, CNN in Espanol, and CBS News Radio. He has served on the editorial boards of over 10 scholarly journals. He is the author of 10 books and dozens of scholarly articles. And the focus of our conversation today will be his latest book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything, was just released. There is so much more I could say, believe it or not, about all of his accomplishments and scholarships. But if you aren't incredibly impressed already, he was a member of the University of Oviedo team that won the Spain National Basketball University Championship in 1987. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Guillén.
Marianne, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I'm hoping that the image coming from my end here in my basement in Philadelphia and also the sound are okay. I would like, as Marianne mentioned, to tell you about what's gonna come our way in terms of the new social and economic landscape in the wake of this pandemic. So thinking about the next 5 or 10 years. And I'd like to do so in a way that is as interactive as possible. So Rachel, who is also here joining us over Zoom, she will be taking questions from the chat, I believe, right? Periodically, I will make a stop and take your questions. So you can enter your questions at any time, and Rachel will be curating them, maybe combining them if they are hitting on the same issue. So it's really, really a pleasure. And I would like to share the slides, and of course, the organizers can make the slides available to all of the participants later if they haven't done so already. So let me just go through 2 or 3 steps because I have 2 screens. And now I think you can see the PowerPoints in full screen at your end. Is that correct? Yes? Okay. So the new social and economic landscape. Okay. So once again, I'm going to make a couple of stops along the way so that you can answer your questions, enter them on the in the chat of this application. So look, if you read the media these days, I think you will come across very bold predictions as to what may happen in terms of the evolution of American society and the American economy over the next few years. I think the first bullet point that you see on the screen is certainly true. I think we are definitely in a new age of technology adoption. And of course, the pandemic has only accelerated that. But the other three, I think, are more debatable. You will come across bold predictions such as, for example, the end of commuting, or the demise of retail, or the reversal of globalization. So I would like to put all of these things in context for you today and essentially try to distinguish here between predictions that I think are more likely than others. And of course, I'll be mindful of the fact that some of you come from the for-profit business sector, others work in the nonprofit area, and yet a number of you also are government officials, or you work for the government at different levels. And I'm going to focus my comments mostly on the United States and on cities within the United States. So first of all, I think what is really, really important when it comes to analyzing the effects of this pandemic is to realize that it is an accelerator of trends. It's not the kind of crisis, the kind of emergency that brings things to a stop. Quite on the contrary. What it does is it puts pre-existing trends on steroids, right? It just seems to accelerate everything. Let me give you some examples. So the first is population aging. And you might be wondering, how is the pandemic accelerating population aging? Well, it's relatively straightforward. When confronted by a big crisis, and especially high unemployment, as we're going through now, a lot of young couples decide to postpone having babies. Now, if they postpone having babies, then the birth rate goes down. And as a result of that, the American population, along with the populations of many other countries in the world, will get older faster, okay? Because again, we are gonna have, at least momentarily, for maybe a couple of years, 3 years, fewer babies being born as young couples postpone having babies. The second way in which this crisis is, I think, a huge accelerator is because, in all of those East Asian countries, from South Korea to the north, all the way down to New Zealand, which is in the South Pacific region. And in between, you have Taiwan, Vietnam, China. They have brought this pandemic under control. In Taiwan, they have had fewer than 15 deaths. That's 15 deaths from this pandemic. And therefore, their economies are doing better. So if they were already growing fast before the pandemic, now they're surging ahead. So in other words, COVID-19 is accelerating the trend towards the rising importance of emerging markets in the world, more specifically East Asia. Now, unfortunately, there's a third trend that this pandemic is accelerating, which is inequality. Now, this was going on before the pandemic, but the pandemic has made it very clear to all of us that there are enormous inequalities by race, by ethnicity, some of them by gender, certainly by purchasing power or income level, that are being exacerbated by what's going on. And then, of course, technology adoption. And lastly, I'll say a few words a little bit later about cities and about specific locations with a question mark, because as you know, cities have been evolving in many parts of the world, including here in the United States. And it is the one trend among all of the ones that I'm going to be discussing today that might actually get reversed by this pandemic, okay? So we're going to talk about all of these things, but let me first begin with population trends, just to reiterate what I just mentioned. Economic recessions tend to affect people's fertility decisions, okay? This is very clear. The mere postponement of having babies reduces the fertility rate, and as a result, population aging accelerates. Now, think about what's going on. I think what we are witnessing is a great age bifurcation. The younger age groups in your part of the country, in Ohio, here in Pennsylvania, everywhere throughout the United States, those younger age group, they are facing right now, some of them, a very difficult situation because they don't have the hardware or the software or the internet connection to engage in remote learning. Okay, this is really important to keep in mind, right? Some people are very happy about remote learning. Some people are very unhappy about it. But above and beyond how we feel about it, some people, possibly 20 to 25% of the American population, is not in a position for their children to take advantage of remote learning. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. Now, if you think about the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds, then this pandemic is also a moment of reckoning, because this is the second crisis that they've been going through in their adult lives. Second crisis in 12 years. The previous one, of course, was the one triggered by the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So very different kind of crisis. But for them, the labor market is a very difficult one for a second time since they left school. So that's also something for us to consider. We also have a great educational divide in this country. As you know, people who have an education of a college degree or a postgraduate degree, most of them, they can work remotely. But that's not the case for people without a high school diploma, right? Not only that, their salaries, their wages are increasing faster, or at least they are not decreasing, because their jobs are directly linked to some of the fastest growing parts of the global economy, right? And of course, let's also not forget that this younger age group is becoming increasingly diverse. You see, by the year 2030, I always try to say that in this younger age group, the groups that today we call minorities are going to be more than 50% of the American population by the year 2030, right? Now, the older age groups, look, there's something also really interesting going on there. The baby boomers are retiring. And here in the United States, you may have heard that 80% of the net worth is presently owned by people above the age of 60. So talking about a generational bifurcation here, right? Now, remember, the other really interesting thing about that demographic, people above the age of 60, is that a 60-year-old or a 70-year-old today is in much better mental and physical shape than a 60-year-old or a 70-year-old 30 or 50 years ago. So being 60 or 70 is a completely different experience today. Also because today, a 60-year-old in the United States, on average, is expected to live another 25 to 30 years. And if you're a woman, it's even more than that, an additional 6 years on average. That's another lifetime, right? Ahead of that person over there. And of course, as I mentioned at the bottom of the screen, there's also enormous pressures for people to continue working, maybe because their pension fund is not enough, maybe because they realize they're going to be living for another 25 years, so they never saved enough for that type of a situation. So we have all of these changes converging, right before our eyes, and they are changing so many things. Let me just expand a little bit more on emerging markets and why they are going to be so important, right? So you're in Ohio, I'm here in Pennsylvania, states that are considered to be part of the Rust Belt, right? And of course, there's been many ways in which certain cities, certain towns, certain communities have adapted to the new situation by, for example, developing healthcare or developing education or financial services or other industries that are doing relatively well these days. But the problem, I think, is that we haven't changed our mindset, right? The American consumer market has been the largest in the world for the last 70 years, perhaps 90 years. But by the year 2030, that's no longer going to be the case. The Chinese consumer market will be bigger. So we need to learn how to deliver high standards of living to our communities, to our population here in the United States, without being number one in the world. And that is not impossible. As you know, there are many countries in the world which are relatively small in size, and yet they have incredibly high standards of living. Think about Singapore, think about Denmark, think about Sweden, right? But we need to change our mindset about this. And in particular, we need to recognize that if we want to be successful in this global economy, we're going to have to think very carefully about those emerging markets in Asia, especially in East Asia, because they're going to be the largest in the world, and because they have a lot of consumers, and they could be purchasing our goods and services. So the idea that we can isolate ourselves from globalization is kind of self-defeating, because if the fastest growing markets in the world are not going to be here in the United States, they're going to be in East Asia, then it would be foolish for us, if we want to increase our standards of living, to ignore those markets, or to just say, oh, we're only going to focus on our own domestic market. Once again, because now it's no longer going to be the largest in the world, and it is certainly not the fastest growing. So I understand, of course, that there are emerging markets, as you see in the second bullet point, that are suffering in Latin America, in India right now, because the pandemic is not under control over there. But let me bring to your attention another bright spot in the global economy, which is Africa, right? So Africa will have, by the year 2030, the second largest population in the world when you're comparing regions. Between now and then, 450 million babies will be born. That's a very large number. And what are the challenges in Africa? Well, they need to continue growing the middle class in the cities, and they need to increase productivity in agriculture and industry, while at the same time, they educate those 450 million babies, right? Easier said than done. I think they can do it, right? But it will require quite a bit of investment and planning. But here's the thing. Which is the country in the world that is investing the most in Africa? The country in the world that is paying the most attention to Africa these days? It's no longer the United States or Europe. It's China. And why are they investing there? You may be thinking minerals, oil, land. So I don't want to deny that. They're looking for all of those things. But they have also realized that Africa will have a thriving middle class before we notice it. And they want to be in a position in which they can sell their products and services. So once again, you're in Ohio, I'm in Pennsylvania. We may be thinking today that Africa is way too far away, but you know, Africa is becoming very big. Africa is going to be, I think, the next frontier in the global economy. We need to think about what is it that our organizations, whether you're a nonprofit or you're a for-profit company, what are we going to do about that, right? Because it's going to become a very important part of the world. Here on this slide, you just see what I've been telling you about. This is projections by the Conference Board here in the United States of gross domestic product growth for the last 3 years. 2019, of course, is the actual figure. And then you have the projection for 2020 and the projection for 2021. And first, if you compare all of the rich economies, mature economies, look, the pandemic is going to have a much bigger impact than in the emerging developing economies, right? That's the black bar for 2020. And then the recovery, which is the green bar, is going to be so much more robust in the emerging markets than in the mature economies. I'm assuming you can see my cursor when I move it, right? Okay. Now, if you go to the United States, well, we're going to suffer a lot this year. And it remains to be seen how quickly we will recover. I think to a very large extent, it will depend on what we do with the pandemic, because obviously the economy cannot operate at full capacity unless we bring the pandemic under control. And let me prove that point with this chart over here. We are in a consumer-oriented economy. We know that if the consumer doesn't spend money, then we're in trouble, right? So here what you have is, for the last 25 years, this index of consumer confidence, okay, in the US, and I'm comparing it to the country that is going to become the largest consumer market in the world very soon, which is China. And as you can see, the pandemic hits, the line for the US is the blue one, and we have this collapse at the beginning of the year in terms of consumer confidence. And then we recover, and then the second wave hits in the summer, and then we go down again, right, in consumer confidence. And then we recover it again in the months of August and September, October, and then we take another hit because some bad news are coming again our way regarding the pandemic. So very high correlation between consumer confidence on the one hand and what's going on with the pandemic. And in China, it's a similar thing. They were hit a little bit earlier than us, right? Their problems started in December. They recovered, but you know, their recovery now in terms of consumer confidence over the last, let's say, 3 or 4 months has been much more steady than ours, right? And they seem to be on a, on a path towards a greater consumer confidence, whereas here in the United States, we're still hesitating. And by the way, as you can see, consumer confidence in the US didn't collapse this time around as much as it did during the last crisis in 2008. Remember Lehman Brothers? And my interpretation for that is not just that the Federal Reserve came to the rescue this time around much more swiftly, but also that this time we had technology. And consumers, even those who were reluctant to use technology before this pandemic, are now using it. And that has saved the day for us. Imagine if during this pandemic, we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have marketplaces, we didn't have all of those other things or platforms, digital platforms that we're using as consumers these days, okay? So really important, I think, moving forward to think about how consumer confidence is going to be affected by the pandemic, by the high unemployment, by the uncertainty, and the very, very important link between consumer confidence and then how the economy does. So in about 7 minutes or so, I'm going to begin taking questions from you. Okay, so please make sure that you use the chat if you would like to add a question or also a comment. That's also fine. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, Rachel, for another 6 minutes or so. So I would like to then dig a little bit deeper and see how different kinds of organizations across the economy are being affected by the pandemic, okay? And, you know, I always like to ask the chief financial officers the question as to what do they think is going to change? And there's a survey that was conducted by PwC, the consulting company, in April, May, and June. And there were many questions on that survey, but I want to bring to your attention 3 of them. So one was, do you think that your company or organization, right, for these CFOs, will make remote work a permanent option for the roles that allow it? And as you can see, roughly speaking, about half of them said yes. The second question is, do you think you're going to be accelerating automation and new ways of working as a result of this pandemic? And as you can see, about 40% say yes. And I'm going to return to each of these things. And then lastly, are you going to reduce your real estate footprint? Well, about a third of them were saying that they might do so. So I want to bring to your attention then, before we are done today, to 4 topics that I think are being affected. So supply chains, automation, remote work, and consumer behavior. So let me speak about supply chains for 3 or 4 minutes, and then we will take the first round of questions. And after that, we will continue with automation, remote work, and changes in consumer behavior. So supply chains, as you know, every company, every organization, a nonprofit, it could be a hospital, for example, they all want business continuity. They want continuity in their operations. And anticipating and avoiding disruptions in their supply chains is extremely important. Once again, think about hospitals over the last few months, but not just hospitals, every kind of organization and companies. They've actually seen their operations being disrupted by interruptions in their supply chains, right? This has been a common experience, and I'll show you some data in a moment. And by the way, the pandemic is not the first time that this has happened. Because of the trade wars most recently, we've seen a lot of companies scrambling to try to find the right supplies at the right price, okay, for whatever they need to secure. So specifically now, let's talk about the impact on supply chains here in the United States. This comes from a survey of managers of supply chains, okay, as opposed to CFOs, from a large sample of American organizations, including companies and nonprofits. And well, 71% of them experience volume declines. And as you can see, transit delays, also a very high number, delays from port to customer, lack of capacity in some cases because they've seen their demand for essential goods and services go through the roof. Okay, those were the lucky ones during this crisis. Now, when you ask them, what are you planning to do? Are you going to change the way in which you have structured your supply chain? Well, you see that 42% say yes as a result of this crisis, and an additional 28.9% said maybe. So 2/3 are saying, yes, we're going to change our supply chain. And then when you ask them, what do you think is needed? And this is where I think things become really interesting. They say, okay, we're going to invest in assets. We're going to invest in employees. We're going to maybe make acquisitions. But most of them, 2/3, we're going to invest in technology, right? So data-driven technology, maybe automation, these sorts of things that may help them overcome those bottlenecks, those interruptions along the supply chain. By the way, huge opportunity here for the cloud, right? Because the cloud is pay-per-use. You can scale it up, you can scale it down, but most importantly, is highly resilient. So one thing that we're seeing in the wake of this pandemic is that many companies, many organizations that didn't use the cloud before the pandemic now have realized the cloud is the way to go because it's resilient, right? Okay. Even if I have to shut down, even if my employees cannot go to the office, we can still continue to operate. So what is it that I think in the last minute before I take questions that I think is going to happen with these supply chains? I think a lot of companies, a lot of organizations in the US, and again, think not only about for-profit companies, think about hospitals, think about all of those other organizations that need supplies. They're going to move away from the famous just-in-time principle to the just in case. And I've coined that term, just in case something happens, just in case there is a trade war, just in case there is a pandemic, just in case there's an earthquake. So they're going to diversify their supply chains, and they're going to be holding more inventories. So in other words, they're going to be willing to give up some efficiency to pay a higher price in exchange for more reliability. And you know what? This has already been going on in the US. So this is for all organizations in the US, public, private, in all of the sectors of the economy. This is the monthly inventory to sales ratio, okay? So look, from 1992 to the previous financial crisis, they were holding less and less inventory, right? Because inventory is here in the numerator divided by sales, okay? Less. The crisis hits, suddenly their sales plummet, so the ratio goes through the roof momentarily, then it comes down. Since the last crisis, when we started to see problems in supply chains, they've been increasing their levels of inventories on average. Do you see it over here? Right? It's remarkable, right? Now, this pandemic hits, and once again, sales decline very suddenly. So the ratio shoots up. But, by August or September of this year, the ratio has come down to normal levels. I will predict right now, let's see if I'm correct or not, we shall see that this trend will continue. Organizations in the US, for-profit, non-profits, they're holding more inventory of wherever it is that they need in their supply chains, okay? So let me stop there, because that, I think, is one of the biggest things that we're going to see, which is supply chain changes. But you can also ask questions, Rachel, or bring up questions about the other topics, the broader topics that I started with at the beginning. Go ahead.
Great. So we do have a question going back to some of the changes in the economy. So is there any way to hold on to our position as the largest economy? And how can we narrow the gap between our economic growth and China's?
Yeah, that's going to be really hard for two reasons. One, let's not forget there are 1.3 billion Chinese. And we are a much smaller country. And they're getting richer as time goes by because their economy is growing faster. And then let's also not forget, there's another 1.3 billion people in India. And India is also doing relatively well, or was up until the pandemic. Now they're having a little bit of trouble dealing with the pandemic, more so than China, to be sure. But that's another large country in the world. And they are emerging markets. Emerging markets tend to have rates of growth of GDP of 6, 7, 8, in some cases even 10, 12%. The American economy, we are very happy when it grows at 3% or 3.5%. So inevitably, they're going to grow faster than we will over the long run, right? And you might be thinking, well, but we still have technology. Sure, but they're catching up in terms of technology as well. Look, in India, they train 300,000 engineers every year, 300,000. And they all speak English, by the way. All right. And secondly, in China, look at how many people are online and they're using the latest online technologies, right? So I'm not saying that they are ahead of us. I'm not saying that we will get impoverished as a result. All I'm saying is that I think it's pretty much inevitable that we will no longer have the largest consumer market in the world, and we will not have the largest economy either. But that doesn't mean we're going to be poor. Once again, there are very small countries in the world that are extremely rich, in fact, richer than we are on a per capita basis. So I think that's really important. It's inevitable. We need to change our mindset. Rachel, do you have others?
I do. So kind of going off of the technology piece, US financial markets are at all-time highs with robust technology. So thinking of China and their strong economy, do you think their tech companies will also begin to edge out the US companies?
Well, not here in the US, because some of our tech companies have established themselves here in the United States. And as you know, actually, the Justice Department is launching antitrust investigations precisely for that reason, right? So you have Google and Facebook and Uber and so on and so forth. However, in China, you don't have Google, you don't have Uber, you have Didi, you don't have Facebook, you have WeChat, right? Those are the Chinese versions. And what's going on is that they are expanding in other East Asian countries and South Asian countries, and of course into Africa, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we're going to be switching from Facebook to WeChat or from Uber to Didi here in the United States. But they will be those big Chinese digital platforms. They will be gaining, users, gaining market share, not only in China, of course, where they are already very well established, but also in other parts of the world. And remember, once again, the parts of the world that are growing are not Europe or the United States, right? Or Japan, for that matter. It's those emerging markets.
So there's been a lot of talk around onshoring the last few months to try and eliminate issues in global supply chains, delays in shipping, and consistent quality. Do you see that continuing and picking up speed?
Well, yes and no. You see, the effect of the trade war, and this is very well documented, I'm happy to send you the report, has been not that we're getting more onshoring. That is to say, American companies that used to manufacture something abroad, now they're doing that at home. Rather, what we're seeing is that American firms have diversified. So instead of producing everything in China, now they're also producing in Vietnam, or they're producing in Taiwan or in Bangladesh. And then there's been much more near-shoring than onshoring, meaning more of that production leaving China by going to Mexico, as opposed to coming here to the United States. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be really hard to bring back some of that production. But what we can do, however, is grow the manufacturing in other parts of the economy that are booming and where we have amazing companies, such as, for example, aerospace. We just saw the launching of this rocket by SpaceX, or electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. So I see, that nearshoring might win over onshoring, right? So Mexico, Central America might win over, things coming back here to the United States. There will be some onshoring, to be sure, but I think that proportionally speaking, nearshoring is going to be higher.
So how will this shift in diversifying the supply chain and just in case impact consumer prices and company margins?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It will inevitably either increase prices for consumers or reduce company margins, or both. But I think that both companies and consumers will understand, after the experience we've been going through, that resilience is something that we should pay for. Okay? In other words, that there is a trade-off between cost and resilience. And I think both companies and consumers now are more willing to pay a little bit more in terms of lower margins in the case of companies, or higher prices in the case of consumers, if we have more resiliency. Let me just put it in very simple terms. People like to be able to buy toilet paper. They don't want to be competing for toilet paper. So I think people will say, I'm willing to pay a couple of cents more if I am guaranteed that I will have the toilet paper when I need it. And this is just one example. It may sound trivial, but I think that is the thinking, right? Let's take one more.
One more? Okay. So let's go with, what do you think the long-term impact, positive or negative, on current and future work from home options that employers have put into practice?
Yeah, great. So that's going to be something that I'm going to be talking about in a moment. Okay. So let me cover that question, and then I'm going to try to finish in 12 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. Okay. So I want to tell you first about automation. Look, this pandemic introduces new incentives for automation in manufacturing, but especially in the service sector and in customer-facing jobs. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to be in the age of social distancing. And also companies have learned that human beings sometimes cannot show up for work, but machines can. So unfortunately, I think for certain occupations, we're going to see more incentives for automation. Take warehouse automation. So this is data coming from a survey of warehouse managers in the United States. And the blue bar that you see over here is how much they thought they would be spending on warehouse automation before the pandemic hit. And then the gray is their revised forecast based on the fact that the pandemic has occurred. Well, for the year 2020, they're going to invest less, but that's because every company is trying to save money, right? But look at how they revised their forecasts for 21, 22, and 23. They are planning now to invest more in warehouse automation as a result of the pandemic. This is just one example. But we're seeing this in hospitality. Some hotels are roboticizing room service, okay? I mean, it's getting to that point, right? Healthcare and telemedicine. Education, I may not be around in a few years, right? Okay? The government, legal work, office work, retail. There's going to be so much more automation, right? Now, you can tell me, well, is this good or bad? I think this can be really good, but it can also be really bad. And of course, the problem is, what do we do with those people or those communities who are displaced by automation? And my hope is that we don't make the same mistake that we made 10 or 15 years ago, which was to ignore them, right? Like happened here in Pennsylvania or in Ohio and many other places around the Rust Belt here in the United States. And I have two solutions. Up until recently, I thought that a guaranteed basic income was a radical idea that only extremists would propose. But I think the time has come to have a serious national conversation about a guaranteed minimum income. And then secondly, I'm sure you pay taxes. I pay taxes. I think the robots should also pay taxes. And with the money that we raise from taxing the robots, we could retrain, we could address the needs of those communities and those individuals who are displaced by automation. I don't think there's any other solution because, once again, the incentives for automation are very powerful and the pandemic only accelerates them. So I'm trying to be realistic about all of this. Now, remote work. Well, after 9 months of this amazing experiment in terms of remote work, we have learned the advantages and the disadvantages of remote work, both the workers, the employees, and the employers. Okay, this is very clear. You can read that on the board, on the screen. I'm not going to go over the details, right? So there are pluses and minuses, pros and cons to remote work. Okay, so what is it that I think is going to happen? I don't think you and I are going to keep on working from home forever, 24/7. I think we're going to move towards hybrid arrangements for two reasons. One is that I think we all appreciate the flexibility, but we also need to interact with other people. And companies are reporting that coordination is becoming more and more difficult as the pandemic continues and a large percentage of their workforces are dispersed. I think virtual teams are going to become so much more important than in the past. So like with any kind of technology, I think the way of the future is to try to see how we can use these digital tools to improve creativity and productivity, but probably under a hybrid model. Maybe I will go to the office twice a week and I will work, from home 2 days, and then I will travel for business once, the situation goes back to some kind of normality. So I think that's where we're going, right? We're going towards more flexibility in these arrangements for the jobs that allow remote work. By the way, a key concern should be cybersecurity. When you have so many employees working dispersely, this is a recipe for problems. And look, a survey of IT departments here in the United States in the month of April, 30% had strengthened their security protocols because, you have now people accessing customer data, supplier data, market data, employee data from their homes. But 29% relaxed their security protocols because they weren't prepared for this. And unless they did that, their employees wouldn't be able to get their work done from the home, right? This is dangerous, right? And 36%, no change. Once again, I think the cloud may provide like a great solution for these kinds of cybersecurity problems. And by the way, the federal government, I don't know about the state government in Ohio or local governments, but only 15% of the federal government is on the cloud, which in my view is a big problem. It should be 85%, not 15%, right? For all of the reasons that we've been talking. And by the way, also for national security considerations, not just business considerations or domestic considerations. So the other issue, of course, is for remote work, as I said earlier, for remote learning, access and inclusion. We need to work on this, right? I mean, this is going to be a big problem. There are inequalities in terms of the hardware that people have or not have, that doesn't have, the software, and also access to Wi-Fi, right? 10 to 15% of low-income households in the United States don't have a high-speed connection. How in the world are we expecting those children to learn? So this also translates into remote work as well, right? There are these inequalities because not everybody has access to remote work. About 35% of American jobs can be fully performed on a remote basis, but not everybody has access to that possibility. And it tends to be lower income people, members of minority groups, and more women, by the way, who need to show up for work. And in so doing, of course, they get more exposed to the virus because oftentimes also they need to catch public transportation to get to work. So in other words, this pandemic, from the point of view of remote work and remote learning, has been fantastic as an experiment, but at the same time, it's a huge machine that is generating more inequality. And this is something that we need to watch very, very carefully. So cities, 1% of the land in the world, but 55% of the population. Here in the United States, of course, is more like 85%. 80% of the carbon emissions, 1% of the land, 55% of the population. So we're going to have to address climate change by addressing how we have built cities and how cities consume resources and use energy. That's what I'm trying to say here, right? But then you might be wondering, how is remote work going to be affecting cities? Well, I think there's going to be a bifurcation in the world. In the US and Europe, I strongly believe that a lot of people are going to decide in the age of remote work, at least partially, hybrid, they're going to decide to live further away from their office. And perhaps not even in the suburbs. Maybe they actually will choose to live further away than the suburbs because the price and the amenities and the landscape will be so much more attractive. However, quite frankly, in Africa, in South Asia, in those kinds of places, I think cities will continue to grow because the attractiveness of moving to the city is still just too big, even in the age of fears about pandemics and so on and so forth. And then lastly, consumer behavior. How is that going to change, right? I think it's important, even if you're working for a nonprofit organization or for the government, to understand this. First, there is the phenomenon of pent-up demand. Remember, whenever we come out of a recession, there's always this problem here that needs to be addressed by all kinds of organizations. But more importantly, I think we're going to see shifts in consumer preferences along the lines that I'm going to tell you in a moment. And also, I want to bring to your attention some really important relationship between brands on the one hand and societal tensions about race and about gender discrimination. So first, consumers are asking so much more questions in the wake of this crisis about supply chains, about the provenance of the product and all of the ingredients or the components of the product, about the ethics involved in the supply chain, and about the fairness of the supply chain. So this is what all of the surveys from the last few months are indicating, that people are asking more questions about the origin of the things that they're buying, okay? Secondly, people are emphasizing safety, experience, and psychological comfort. Now, those are three product attributes that fall under these categories, theoretical categories that we have in the world of marketing: functional, social, and self-expressive product attributes. So once again, every survey is indicating consumers are expressing more concerns about safety, about experience, and about psychological comfort. The list can get longer: psychological and mental well-being, quality of life, quality time, safety, as I said, more space in the home, the small pleasures, the simple things in life, introspection and soul searching. So in many of these consumer surveys, you can see that people are emphasizing these things. I put a question mark because that's really the important question. Is this temporary? Is it gonna go away once the pandemic is behind us? Or are these features gonna become a permanent characteristic of consumer behavior moving forward into the future in the United States? Something that I think is really important to consider and to ponder. And then lastly, brands and tensions in society. You see, what we're finding is that the twin crises that we've seen this year, the pandemic and then racial, and prior to that, gender discrimination, inequality, and all of that, and injustice, that people are, not just in the United States, but across the board, increasingly asking companies, and in particular brands, to speak to those tensions in society, to go beyond just offering whatever products they're offering, but to address these issues: access to remote work, access to remote learning, the impact of automation, the impact that all of this is having on children, racial injustice, and so on and so forth, right? And look, this data from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a very good source for this kind of thing, what we're seeing is that the percentages of the population who believe that brands should also help us respond to the pandemic, above and beyond just selling their products to us, are very high. It's 61% in the United States. It's even higher in some emerging markets, right? So people, consumers, are expecting organizations, specifically for-profit companies, to do more, right? Helping all of us get out of this really big problem that we have right now. So I have a concluding slide for later, Rachel, but let's stop here again because I've put a lot of topics on the table, and I'm sure there are some questions.
Definitely. So let's start with how might the automobile industry be affected by technology in the pandemic?
Well, what I understand about the automobile industry is that right now people are using the car more so than public transportation out of fear of getting the virus, right? So that seems to be like a good thing. Now, we're also using the automobile much less because, again, a third of the population is essentially working from the home, right? Like most of us, I'm sure, are these days, but not everybody. So that's a one layer of change. But another one that I think is extremely important is that, look, at some point, we're going to go electric, right? And I think, the American economy has demonstrated that we can have the most advanced electric car or vehicle industry in the world, maybe alongside with China, right? Maybe. But with companies such as Tesla and then all of the suppliers around Tesla, and so many of our more established companies also moving in that direction, including GM and Ford, I think that is, something really important to keep track of. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the automobile industry, where it is located right now, and I understand Ohio is a very important part of the picture right now, that will remain in the same way in the future, right? Because that industry could be migrating to other parts of the United States, as it has happened in the past. If you remember, Tennessee or Alabama or South Carolina didn't have much of an automobile industry 30 years ago. But then the Japanese and then the South Koreans and the Europeans decided to establish their factories over there. So that's something that at the state level, I think is extremely important to track. But I believe that the American electric vehicle industry has a bright future ahead of it.
So as more brick and mortar retailers are going out of business, what do you foresee happening to shopping malls and shopping centers?
Yeah, well, shopping malls, I think, are going to have a lot of trouble, to be sure. But they were already having trouble before the pandemic because that concept was losing a lot of its appeal well before the pandemic struck. And of course, as you know, shopping malls try to anchor, that's the technical term that they use, on the presence of big stores like Neiman Marcus, right? Or what's another one? Nordstrom. And many of those bigger, big anchors, right? That when they open in a shopping mall, then other smaller retailers decide to co-locate. Some of them are going bust, or they're shutting down locations, stores, especially at shopping malls, because they're having a lot of trouble and they're moving online, right? So I think shopping malls, I'm not going to say they're doomed, but quite a few are going to shut down. But it's not something that the pandemic has triggered. The pandemic has accelerated that trend. This was already going on, in my view.
So you mentioned online security, and how do you see security online developing?
Well, I think this is the next frontier for everything from national security, because as you know, these days, the US Defense Department is more worried about cyber warfare than it is about conventional war, right? As we know it. All the way down to organizations. Information data has become so important, so central to all sorts of businesses, from agriculture to manufacturing to retail, digital platforms, of course, all kinds of services. So I think that protecting your data in your organization, whether you're for-profit, non-profit, and especially government, right? Think about elections, think about payroll data, think about contractor data in governments and all of that. I mean, this is the next frontier. And if you have a company or an organization that sells services for cybersecurity, you're going to be making a killing, right? Because the demand for that is only going to go up. I mean, we are a data-driven economy now, and cybersecurity is just one of the priorities now for all kinds of organizations in terms of their investing, including the government. So again, all the way from national security down to the smaller firms, I think investments in cybersecurity are just going to go through the roof.
How could you see an immigration policy change impacting GDP growth, the aging US population, or repopulation of cities like Cleveland?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you know, in my new book, I actually, in the first chapter, I try to sing the praises of immigration. Now, of course, I'm an immigrant myself. I was born in Spain and I came to this country. I've been living here now for 35 years. So I guess at some level I'm biased. But you mentioned the case of Cleveland. I don't know it as well as some other cases like Buffalo, New York, Chattanooga, Tennessee, where immigration has actually led to the revival of the downtown areas, right? So look, immigration can be a force for good. Most immigrants tend to be middle-aged, so they're working age population. They pay taxes. They are eager to get ahead. They work hard. Um, but immigration comes in two kinds: highly educated individuals like myself, or people that don't have any education at all. I think the American economy needs both. But of course, completely open immigration doesn't work either. So what we need is some, rational model of immigration that serves us in terms of rebalancing the age structure, because I don't know otherwise who's going to pay for the pensions and the healthcare of all of the baby boomers who are retiring. Remember, now every generation is smaller in size than the older generation, right? Because we're having fewer and fewer babies as time goes by. But also because companies in the United States always complain that they don't have enough workers. And especially they complain about not having enough unqualified workers at one end, and at the other end, highly qualified workers, right? See the two extremes. So I think we need to have a targeted immigration policy that addresses that. And as the person asking the question mentioned, I think immigration can also play an important role in terms of rebalancing the age structure of the population in the US at a time when, just to put it simply, we're not having enough babies, right? So we either have more babies, and that's all fine with me. As you know, it's a very popular thing to do, or we bring in more young people from other parts of the world who are willing to work at either end, either highly qualified or with no educational qualifications, but people who are willing to work hard.
So you've mentioned a few times the inequality in technology access. And what might be the best approach to help overcome that inequality?
Well, I think there are two issues here, right? So one is equipment, meaning the hardware, the software, and the Wi-Fi connection. Chattanooga, Tennessee, I always like that example. As you know, they've made high-speed internet freely available to every resident, including both families and companies. And this lies at, I think, their success in terms of attracting high-tech businesses, right? So quite frankly, I think that is a proven model that works. Now, you still have the hardware problem, but maybe you can persuade Microsoft, you can persuade Apple, to help you with that, right? But I think the other issue is that even if we had a level playing field in terms of access to a Wi-Fi connection and in terms of having the equipment that you need, you still have the problem that children in better educated households where the parents have, college degrees, they tend to do better, right? They have more help in the home. They have a role model, right? So that's harder, I think, to address, right? But quite frankly, I think we're getting into a situation with young people in this country in which we have two very different young populations. We have a young population that, makes it to college and beyond, and we have another one that doesn't. And by the way, within that one, then we also have, teen mothers and single teen mothers and so on and so forth. So people who live in poverty cannot escape from it, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to work on that because that's another bifurcation, another polarization that we're seeing in this country among young people. And I think that's extremely dangerous for the future.
I think we have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
And early on, you talked about needing to shift mindsets. So can you elaborate more about the need for us to shift our mindset, and what will be the 3 things you would recommend us doing?
Yeah. Okay. So 3 things. Let me just present it in the following way. So yes, we need to change our mindset. Point number 1, do not believe anybody who tells you that we can turn the clock back, that we can go back to the good old days, that somehow we can return to whatever was the golden age. That is not possible. That's not the way history works. I have never seen that happen in any country around the world. Okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to be proactive about what kind of a future we want to create here, right? And of course, we need to do so mindful of the fact that some people will be, or some communities will be in a better position to take advantage of whatever future we try to create than others. And I think, and again, I would try to avoid at all costs the problem or the mistake that we made a few years ago, I would say about 10 years ago, especially in the wake of the previous crisis. We just said, oh, the economy is recovering, we don't need to do anything. And we didn't realize that all of those communities were being left behind with higher unemployment, with automation taking its toll, with free trade taking its toll. And of course, those people grew resentful, right, of everyone else in the country. So that's the second point. And the third point, to put it very simply, is all of you work for organizations, whether they're for-profits, non-profits, the government, that have an impact on things. And this is what I will tell you. The world is in flux. Everything is changing. So by all means, don't make any big decision that is irreversible. Because if you make irreversible decisions, you may be running yourself and your organization into a corner, right? From which, or into a hole you cannot escape. So ponder your options very carefully. Always keep them open. Keep the doors open behind you, because you may have to reverse course because the world is changing so quickly. So don't make investments. Don't make big decisions. Don't come up with a strategic plan that is so inflexible that makes it very difficult to correct course in real time, makes it very difficult to even reverse course if you need to. So once again, there's no turning back, okay? We can create our own future, but we need to make sure that we avoid the problem from 10 or 15 years ago that we left way too many people, way too many communities behind. And then number 3 is don't make irreversible decisions. For me, those are, the most important principles to use at this point.
Dr. Guillén, we are so thankful for your time and your insights today. I think this is wonderful information and so much to ponder, and we thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Let me stop sharing now.
Okay. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Marianne.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Dr. Guillén, this was fabulous. We are so grateful to you for giving of your time today. You should all know that Dr. Guillén finished a class and rushed immediately to join us so he could enlighten all of us. And we truly, truly appreciate it. So thank you for the great information and inspiration that you shared.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's really an honor to be able to reach, so many people from my basement in Philadelphia. That's where I am right now. And it's really rewarding also to see what kinds of questions and comments you have about, the things that I spend my entire day thinking about. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. And I put it in the chat, but just so to remind everyone, Dr. Guillén's recently released book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Christine. And I see the bookmark in it, so the binding is cracked. Well done.
Yeah, it's right here.
So great holiday giving.